For those of you who saw the early advertising for the program, tonight's plan was to feature not one, but two distinguished speakers. Ken Gormley, you just met, who's the Dean of the Duquesne University Law School, and also Benton Becker, who was the young man then who negotiated the pardon with Richard Nixon. Unfortunately, Mr. Becker is unable to be with us tonight due to illness, but through the wonders of videotape, he will be a part of this presentation. And he asked me to be sure to assure all of you that he will come again in the future to share the entire pardon story. It is quite riveting, but I think you'll get a sense of that tonight. Benton Becker served as special counsel to President Ford, and prior to that was the lead counsel in the confirmation hearings in both the House and the Senate when Ford was reviewed to be the vice president. He was then personally sent by President Ford to California to negotiate the terms of the pardon with Richard Nixon. He is a longtime trustee of the Ford Foundation and a true friend of this library and museum. And one of the things that's amazing to me, even though I'm here at the library, is to look at that timeline in that video and realize what a tight span, we're talking roughly 10 days from start to finish in terms of that research and decision making. Now, you've already met Ken Gormley just a few minutes ago. As I said, he's dean and professor at the Duquesne University School of Law in Pittsburgh. He joined the faculty there in 1994 after prior teaching at the University of Pittsburgh School of Law and also private practice. He earned his bachelor's degree from the University of Pittsburgh, summa cum laude, and was elected to Phi Beta Kappa, and his JD degree is from Harvard Law School. Ken is known as a leading constitutional scholar and is nationally recognized as an expert on Watergate and related subjects, and you'll learn more about that this evening. Dean Gormley is the author of two award-winning books, Archibald Cox, Conscience of a Nation, and the New York Times bestseller, The Death of American Virtue, Clinton versus Starr. Currently, he is editing a book about U.S. presidents and the Constitution. In addition to his own research on Watergate, Ken Gormley and Benton Becker have made a number of joint presentations regarding the pardon, including sessions at the Chautauqua Institute in New York in August, and at the Duquesne Law School on September 8th, which was the exact 40th anniversary of the pardon. In addition, yesterday morning, Ken led a panel discussing the pardon as part of a symposium on constitutional issues that was a collaboration between the Ford Presidential Foundation, the Ford Presidential Museum, and the National Constitution Center in Philadelphia. It was a great success, and I think I can assure you you'll enjoy tonight's program. Having had the pleasure of hearing Ken yesterday, I can assure you that we could have no one more knowledgeable nor better prepared to share the background and nuances of President Ford's decision to pardon Richard Nixon. So please join me in welcoming Dean Gormley to the Ford Presidential Library.
Thank you very much, and I would like to thank Elaine and Joe Calvaruso and all of the staff at the Ford Library and the Ford Museum for all of their work. And it's wonderful to be in this beautiful setting to talk about these historic events. I have done a lot of work on this period of American political and legal history. And as Elaine mentioned, I had the privilege of writing the biography of Archibald Cox, the Watergate special prosecutor, most of you remember, who became a hero for standing up to President Nixon during the Watergate crisis and subpoenaing tapes from the secret White House taping system that would prove or disprove Nixon's complicity in the Watergate cover-up. And so this year we've been celebrating 40th anniversaries of lots of historic events. President Nixon's resignation took place 40 years ago, August 8th, and Gerald Ford's pardon, that is the subject of our gathering tonight, took place 40 years ago last month on September 8th. And we did do a big program yesterday at the Gerald Ford Museum, but Elaine insisted that we bring it to Ann Arbor, and so that's why we're here to make sure that we have a fabulous program this evening. And so to officially begin tonight's program, we have a special filmed piece from Tom Brokaw, the iconic news anchor from NBC, who covered the events of the pardon as they unfolded. Mr. Brokaw was unable to come to Michigan for these two events, but he did share his recollections, especially for these historic gatherings. So if we could roll the Brokaw film.
How well I remember Gerald Ford's pardon of Richard Nixon, the disgraced president who was forced to leave office because of Watergate. It was a Sunday morning. The social climate in Washington by then was very relaxed. You must remember all that we had been through in that city. In the fall of 1973, Spiro Agnew had been forced to resign. Then we had the long siege of Watergate, the Supreme Court decision, the tortured explanation by Richard Nixon, and ultimately his resignation. There was an enormous amount of relief, not just in Washington, but across the country, and such goodwill for Gerald Ford, who seemed like a decent man who would always do the right thing. I was at a brunch at the home of the housing secretary, Carla Hills, when we began to hear that Gerald Ford was about to pardon Richard Nixon. It seemed like it was a signal that come from outer space, from some kind of an alien environment. But in fact, it was true. Tables were overturned, people were rushing to cars, trying to get to the office, trying to get to the White House to file the stories, to figure out what was going on. I ended up at the White House and the phones were ringing off the hook. It was instantly and enormously an unpopular decision. I've always believed that President Ford, an essentially decent man, had prepared the country in some fashion by saying, I'm going to ask President Nixon to acknowledge his wrongdoing, to find some way for him to say to the country how wrong he was, because he had not done that. And then I'm going to consider a pardon, a kind of negotiation that would go on in any kind of a prosecution. But he didn't do that. He wanted to put it behind him as quickly as possible. That was part of the Gerald Ford instincts. And it served him well as a man, and it served him well, probably in the long run, as a politician, because he had no guile. There was no hidden agenda. He thought this was the right thing to do. At NBC, the calls came in, and they were almost universally critical. The country thought the president should pay a higher price for all that he had put the nation through. In the final analysis, how will history treat all of us? It's always hard to know. My own judgment is that Gerald Ford, his standing in history, will be unsullied by his decision to pardon Richard Nixon. People will talk about it, but by and large, they'll find him as a very competent caretaker who found himself in the highest office of the land in the most unexpected circumstances. And Richard Nixon, could there be any greater punishment than to have to be the only president in American history who was forced to resign because of his illicit, illegal behavior in the Oval Office and beyond? That was torture for Richard Nixon. It will never, ever be eased by a pardon, by a president, or by the rewriting of history. So we should keep that in mind as well. What I remember most of all, however, was that in Washington in those days, you woke up in the morning and had no idea what would happen next. And there was nothing more stunning than to hear that the President of the United States was about to pardon the former President of the United States. I'm Tom Brokaw, NBC News in New York.
So let's go back to the late summer of 1974 as President Nixon is engulfed in the Watergate scandal. How do we get there? And again, some people who will be viewing this weren't alive at that time, but Nixon, as you remember, had won an overwhelming re-election victory in 1972. Now, all of a sudden, he's fighting for his life because White House operatives had been caught conducting a burglary in the Democratic National Committee headquarters in the Watergate Hotel in Washington. And now Nixon is implicated in covering it up and offering to pay $1 million in hush money to silence the perpetrators. And meanwhile, in the midst of all of that, Nixon's Vice President Spiro T. Agnew pleads nolo contendere to tax evasion charges after being caught accepting bribes in little white envelopes and resigns almost overnight. And so Gerald Ford, the House Republican minority leader, a Republican stalwart who was actually preparing to retire, all of a sudden, and isn't much of a household name, all of a sudden becomes vice president. It was only when members of his own party came to the White House to tell Nixon they would no longer support him that he announced that he was going to resign. And so that's when the next day at noon, Nixon salutes and flies off in a green helicopter. And Vice President Gerald Ford, who had only been in that office for 10 months, becomes President of the United States. So now Ford faces a crisis of his own. What do you do with this predecessor? And within days of his taking office on August 9th, journalists already begin peppering him with questions. Are you going to consider pardoning Richard Nixon? That's not exactly what Ford was looking forward to on his first week in the job. So on one hand, Ford knew it was crazy to even consider pardoning Nixon. The country had been ripped apart by Watergate. By now, obviously, Nixon was perceived by a villain by people of both political parties. And one of Ford's top advisors, Bob Hartman, told me that he said to Ford categorically, do not do this. You'll be eaten alive by the press. Your chances of ever being elected in your own right in 1976 will be shot to hell if you pardon Nixon. On the other hand, Ford, and many of you know this because if you know his history, he had a strong sense of what to do. He was a man who had grown up in very modest surroundings here in the Midwest. He was the adopted, maybe not even officially adopted, son of a paint and varnish salesman from Grand Rapids, put himself through college on a football scholarship, went through Yale Law School by coaching football. He was known in Congress as an honest, square-jawed, straight-shooting person for 25 years. And now he has a problem because after really thinking this through and consulting with his wife, Betty, only a couple of people, he concluded that pardoning Nixon was probably his only real choice. Why? Because one, he was certain that the country would be dragged through the muck for another 2 years if he didn't pardon Nixon. And secondly, and I did have a chance to interview President Ford several times, he said from a selfish point of view, he would never be able to advance any of his own initiatives as president as long as Nixon was still on the stage. So that's where this segment of this incredible story begins. Gerald Ford takes office with only 1 day's prior notice. He's as stunned as everyone else. He's surrounded by aides, and you have to realize this, it's a key part of the story. Aides and advisors who were primarily Nixon's aides and advisors are all of a sudden his. Chief of Staff General Alexander Haig, Attorney General William Saxby, Nixon's 5th Attorney General because of Watergate. Former Press Secretary Ron Ziegler, who's become Nixon's handler from afar in California. And in the midst of this hullabaloo, there's a question all of a sudden of packing up these records and tapes of President Nixon. There are only a couple of people surrounding President Ford whom he trusts. Bob Hartman, his chief speechwriter, Phil Buchan, longtime friend, law partner from Grand Rapids, who's special counsel to the president, and Benton Becker, another trusted colleague and now special counsel to the president. Most of the people in this historic drama are no longer with us, but one of them, as Elaine mentioned, is Benton Becker, and sadly he wasn't able to be here. I just talked to him this afternoon. He really was upset he was unable to make this trip because of health reasons, but he's asked me to try to share his story with you tonight, and I'll do my very best. Benton Becker had been a young lawyer, as Elaine mentioned, who'd done some legal work for President Ford when he was in Congress on some committees, had helped him with his confirmation hearings as vice president. And so he does become part of Ford's inner circle during this first month. And incidentally, through his oral history, through his memorandum, contemporaneous memo that he wrote to President Ford as these events are taking place that have been kind of lost to a certain extent, but here in the Ford Library, we've been able to piece together what happened. And so here's what we know. Within 24 hours of Nixon leaving office, Nixon picks up the phone and contacts his former chief of staff, Al Haig, who's now Ford's chief of staff, and says, send those boxes out here, all of his papers and tapes. And he had a lot of them. During his 5 years in the White House, he had accumulated 900 reels of tapes. And literally, folks, thousands of boxes of documents, so many that the Secret Service was afraid that the 4th floor of the Executive Office building was going to cave in from the weight of these things. And so Benton Becker was finishing up a briefing with President Ford when General Haig said nonchalantly, as if he was ordering a cup of coffee, "Oh yes, and we need to send those things out to President Nixon in California." Well, Ford's aide stopped the conversation in its tracks and said, "Well, isn't there an issue about who owns these things?" And among other things, they were acutely aware that those records and tapes were going to be key evidence in the trial of all of these Watergate co-conspirators that were set to begin in another month in Washington. So President Ford said, they're not moving anywhere until the Justice Department gives me a legal opinion as to who they belong to. So 4 days later, this group meets with Attorney General William Saxby. Saxby had assigned one of his young, smart lawyers in the Justice Department to write an opinion letter. It turns out that person's name was Antonin Scalia. And this opinion conclusively opined that these records and tapes were the exclusive property of President Nixon by custom and practice. Now, I have to tell you, folks, and Elaine mentioned I'm working on a book on American presidents, that was probably accurate in terms of the custom and practice. Many presidents had kept their papers. Ulysses Grant sold some of his papers to earn money. Chester Arthur burned his papers before he died, which was a common practice among public figures, you may know. So Saxby said, if you don't send those papers out, you'll be thumbing your nose at all of this precedent and at all former presidents. Ford looked over at Benton Becker and said, "What do you think?" And Becker said, "Mr. President, I don't care what good things you accomplish during your 3.5 years remaining in this term. If you send those records and tapes out to California, the only thing people will remember is that Jerry Ford committed the last act of the Watergate cover-up." He said you could have heard a pin drop in the room. Benton also said he thought that might be his last speech in the White House. But Ford was dead silent. Saxby tried to keep talking, and he waved him to be quiet and just thought about it. And he finally said, "Those papers and records and tapes are staying here. They belong to the American people. I'm not giving them up." So that was the beginning of this also layer of animus that grew up with the Nixon people toward the new Ford White House. And it was several days later that President Ford calls Benton Becker up to the residence in the White House and said, "I'm thinking about pardoning Richard Nixon. I need you to do some research. I need to know the legal ramifications." Well, Becker almost fell over. He thought this was crazy, suicidal, but his job was to research and find out what the ramifications of a pardon would be. For instance, can you pardon Richard Nixon when he's not been convicted of any crime yet? Is it just pardoning him for federal crimes or also state crimes? Was it a problem that impeachment proceedings had already begun when Nixon left? And so Becker had to look at all of this. He found that the presidential pardon power was almost unbounded, but he also found something else very important that he shared only with Ford's closest advisors. And that was the existence of a 1915 case decided by the US Supreme Court called Burdick versus United States. This case had involved an effort by President Woodrow Wilson to get an editor in New York to testify in front of the grand jury. And the guy wouldn't testify, he took the fifth, so Wilson thought he would outsmart him. And so he called him back and he had a pardon waiting for him. You know, you can't plead the fifth if you're pardoned of all crimes. And Burdick refused to accept the pardon. He said, I don't want to take a pardon. It makes me look as if I'm guilty of something. Went all the way up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court agreed with Mr. Burdick. And in this case, they said a pardon carries with it an imputation of guilt. Acceptance of a pardon is an admission of guilt. So the Burdick case was extremely important. Benton Becker goes and discusses this with President Ford. And at the same time, Becker and President Ford's other advisors meet secretly with the new special prosecutor, Leon Jaworski, who'd replaced Archibald Cox, who was fired in the Saturday Night Massacre. They want to find out, is Jaworski going to publicly oppose a pardon if Ford offers it? Because if he's going to come out against it, they're going to have big political problems. Well, they're surprised to find out that Jaworski is actually concerned about proceeding with criminally prosecuting Nixon because of the unprecedented publicity from the congressional televised Watergate hearings, which many of you watched, were around the clock. Incidentally, folks, no rules of evidence at the Watergate hearings. You can say anything you want. And my research confirmed that Leon Jaworski quietly signaled his approval of the pardon, even though his own staff would have been horrified if they ever knew that. So Ford makes a decision to send Benton Becker out to California along with President Nixon's personal lawyer, a guy named Herbert Jack Miller. And Becker's job is to hammer out a deal on the records and tapes. And he actually brought with him a draft deed of gift by which Nixon would give the records and tapes over to the government to hold. He would still have complete access to them to write his memoirs and so on. And Becker was also specifically charged with explaining to Nixon this Burdick case and explaining that acceptance of a pardon was a legal admission of guilt. President Ford wanted some acknowledgement of wrongdoing. So why would he choose, a number of people asked in some earlier programs that I've done, why would he choose this guy, this young, unknown lawyer, to handle the most sensitive, dicey political negotiation in the history of the United States? Well, two reasons. First of all, he trusted Benton Becker. And second of all, the press corps wouldn't know who the hell this guy was when he went driving through the gates at San Clemente. Because if the media found out about it, that would blow the whole thing sky high and the negotiations would be ruined. So the first 2 days of these meetings in California at the Nixon compound were a total bust, according to Benton Becker's contemporaneous memo. He never saw Nixon. He was just dealing with Ron Ziegler and the lawyer Jack Miller. They'd go huddle for hours with Nixon and come in and they'd say, yeah, we think this pardon idea makes a lot of sense. We like that. All the other stuff, yeah, we're not sure about. We'll have to deal with that later. So they were just trying to stonewall. Becker later learned, years later incidentally, that as he was in the air flying to California, General Haig was on the phone with Richard Nixon saying, don't give up anything. Ford is in a weak position. He's going to pardon you no matter what. Do not agree to anything else. So inside the Ford White House, he's being undermined by his own people. So Becker, after 2 days of this, finds a secure phone that night and spoke to President Ford, who was angry and upset. He said, I'm ready to grant a pardon and risk my whole political future, and they won't agree to these concessions. He said, give them one more day, and that's it. If they don't agree to this, one more day, and that's it. This is, I think, one of the most dramatic parts of the story, and even though Benton Becker couldn't be here, as Elaine mentioned, we did a program together just last month at the Chautauqua Institution at New York, and so I've taken a clip of that so that you can see Benton Becker himself telling the story in his own words.
Before I went into the conference the next day with Ziegler and Miller, and the others, before I did that, I called the colonel that had piloted the plane that flew us down from Washington to San Clemente, and told him that I'll be leaving about 10:30 tomorrow morning, California time, be ready to take us back. Because I knew that call would get back to Ziegler and so when we met and sat down, I heard some of the same stuff that I've been hearing before. We have a new letter of acceptance for you, Mr. Becker. Look at this language, see if you like this. And the letter would be written in the third point. It would say, the White House staff did terrible things during the war. My staff didn't serve me very well. Nothing would none of that work. So finally, I said, gentlemen, I am going home at 10:30. This is it. When I walk through that door, and I will leave here, the pardon and all discussions on pardons leave with you. For the next few years, there'll be no discussions. Don't come to the White House after Richard Nixon's indicted. And don't come to the White House after Richard Nixon is convicted or sentenced. Don't come to us because you'll be wasting your time as long as Gerald Ford's in that White House. This is your opportunity. If you won't accept it now, then we'll just forget it for the remainder of President Ford's term. And I was trying to demonstrate the anger that President Ford showed to me on the phone the night before. And so with that, Miller said, let me talk to my client Friday. And Miller went in for 30, 40 minutes with Nixon, and he said, I think we can do some things. And we began to then tinker with the records and papers and tapes agreement, and we began to rewrite language that was satisfactory, at least culpability of Nixon. I think the language that they ultimately wrote, I acted very poorly as president during Watergate and so forth. The only thing that remained was the verdict decision. I was obligated, as Miller and Ziegler have been told in advance, to personally advise Richard Nixon of the Ford White House and its position on the U.S. v. verdict. Specifically, their position is going to be the Ford White House position when and if a pardon is issued. And that position is simply this, that Richard Nixon was offered a pardon, and Richard Nixon was informed that he had a right to refuse that pardon. And Richard Nixon understood the law that acceptance of that pardon by him constituted an acknowledgement of guilt. President Ford would not have it any other way without me talking to him, explaining it to him, because the first question he said to me when I came back to Washington was, Nixon, understand verdict. And so that's what went on, and we went through that process. Nixon, I found, was clear-minded and but somewhat depressed, but could express himself well on what he wanted and what he didn't want to do. Except that when we got to the subject of the pardon, the verdict discussion with him was very difficult. It was anxiety-producing, and he was constantly trying to change the subject. He would interrupt me in the middle of a sentence and he'd say, "Did you work in my administration as a lawyer?" No. He'd say, "You're a big fella. Did you ever play football?" There are more important things to talk about, Mr. President. And we went through that slowly, very, very slowly. And when we finally got it done, we got the deed of gift signed, and we got a statement that was acceptable. I could, in good, honest candor, say to President Ford, yes, he understands unequivocally. And I thanked him and left. And I put my hand, I literally had my hand on the back seat of the vehicle that was going to drive me to the base when I heard coming from the compound, Ron Ziegler running out of the building. Don't leave, Mr. Becker, don't leave, the president wants to see you again, meaning President Nixon. And my first reaction was to myself was, oh, damn, he's changed his mind. And so I went back in. He said, he wants to see you, insist on seeing you. So I went back in, and let me describe the room. It was a rather small room for a president and the walls were relatively empty. Richard Nixon was wearing a coat and tie during all of this discussions, and he was standing behind the desk when I came back and walked in the front door to his office. He, when I think about this, when I talk about this, all the imagery always comes back to me. He put his hand down as if to open a drawer in the lower part of his desk and pulled out something, small box, a white box, and he said, "I wanted to thank you." He said, we've been having a lot of bullies over the past year, and at least you weren't a bully. I appreciate that." And he said, "Therefore, I want you to have this white box." And then he simply said, there are no more. There are no more. Pat had to get this, found this in my jewelry box. And I had no idea what he was talking about. And I said, "Thank you." And he said, this is what he said, and the way he said it. He said, "I would like to do more." And he made a gesture as if to say, "Look at this room. Look at this office that's so small." And he said, "Look at this." He didn't say look at it, but he gestured into that. And he said, "They took it all away from me." And I said to myself, "I'm getting the hell out of here." I thanked him for the box he made. He said, "Open it." Opened it, and it was a pair of cufflinks with the presidential seal on it, and went back to Washington.
And those cufflinks are now at the Gerald R. Ford Museum in Grand Rapids. But that night, as they got back to Washington, Becker met with President Ford, went right to the White House, met with President Ford to brief him, and Ford immediately scheduled a press conference for the next day at 11 o'clock. Neither of them slept much, and it wasn't over because at 8:30 in the morning, and that's 5:30 California time, Ron Ziegler called and told Becker, "President Nixon has changed his mind. He doesn't like the statement that he agreed to. He wants to go back to the early one where he blamed it all on his staff," or whatever. And so Benton Becker said to him, "Well, that's fine. I'll let President Ford know that, and I'm certain he'll just cancel the press conference for today." And of course, Ziegler backed off, and the rest is history. So at 11 o'clock, President Ford sat behind his desk in the Oval Office and granted the pardon, with Benton Becker literally standing on the other side of the camera watching. And I have to tell you, folks, and I'm sure many of you, most of you were probably in this same category. I know I was. Most Americans thought the pardon was the wrong decision. It sent the wrong message that powerful politicians were above the law, whereas if any you or I had committed these crimes, we'd be in jail. Ford understood that criticism, but he sincerely believed that pardoning Richard Nixon was the best thing for the country, as he told me repeatedly in our interview in 1995. I wanted to say a word about that interview. I met with Ford in a hotel in New York City. I was working on the biography of Archibald Cox, and as we talked, he pulled out his wallet and pulled out a little scrap of paper. This is all these years later, was still carrying around a scrap of paper and showed me the citation to this case, Burdick versus United States from 1915. I had never heard of it, and I teach constitutional law. But he explained that it stood for the proposition that acceptance of a pardon was legally an admission of guilt, and it was so frustrating to him that the press had never picked up on this, and the American public never really understood it, even though it was an essential part of his decision to pardon Nixon. In fact, that's why he sent Benton Becker out to California, was to basically give Nixon his Miranda rights and tell him, you don't have to accept this thing. And I have to tell you this is one of the most amazing discoveries when I first became interested. After that meeting with Ford, I became so interested because I started changing my view about the pardon. And so I organized a program at Duquesne University, where I'm from in Pittsburgh, in 1999, and many of the people were still alive. One of the people there was Nixon's lawyer, Herbert Jack Miller, who we've been talking about. At that program, Miller acknowledged for the first time, with permission of the Nixon family, that not only was the story accurate that Benton Becker and President Ford were telling me about everything that took place in California, but President Nixon tried to not accept the pardon at first. He was fighting with his lawyer and did not want to accept it because he didn't want any kind of a legal admission of guilt. So Ford believed that he got what the country wanted and needed most, some kind of admission from this fellow, and that fact has been lost on the American public really for all these 40 years. It's also really important to underscore the fact, as Benton Becker would if he were standing here, that it was a top priority by the Ford White House to preserve these records and tapes. And in fact, President Ford was worried primarily that if they got shipped out to California, they would go up in a big bonfire. And I think he was right about that, incidentally. And so today, the only reason we have this rich repository of historic materials was that President Ford stood tough, brokered this deal to hold these documents in check until Congress passed a law governing those records and future presidents in terms of who owned them. And finally, there was a big issue that weighed on Ford having to do with whether or not President Nixon could ever receive a fair trial if he were actually indicted and prosecuted. And my research confirmed that Leon Jaworski was deeply troubled by that fact. So both men worried that this could drag on and on for years. So in my view, ladies and gentlemen, Gerald Ford did what he thought was right, given all of the information that he had. And in the process, he made the single decision that would almost surely keep him from winning the presidential election in 1976. One of the never really publicly told stories that really hit home for me was that Bob Hartman, again, one of Ford's closest advisors, had been sitting in a meeting with President Ford when the president was weighing the pardon. And Bob Hartman said, "Please, Mr. President, can't you just at least wait until after November? The Republicans are going to get crushed in the elections if you do this, and this is also going to destroy your chances in 1976. And he said that Ford shook his head and said, "You know, Bob, too many decisions have been made in this office, this Oval Office, over the past 5 years based upon political considerations. If I decide to pardon Richard Nixon, it's not going to be based upon political calculations. It's going to be because I conclude it's the right thing to do." Can you imagine someone in Washington doing that today? So, of course, Ford did lose the election in 1976 to Jimmy Carter with by a small margin, with a key factor for many voters, including myself. It was the first time I got to vote in a presidential election, actually, being the fact that he had pardoned Richard Nixon. Why didn't, one of the things that is a real mystery about this, and people have asked at programs, and Elaine was asking me yesterday after the program, why didn't the Ford White House communicate all of this better, this story, so that we would know it? Well, first of all, you have to remember Ford had only been in office for a month. He had no transition team. He didn't really have an inner circle of his own yet. And also, many of you remember that the day of the pardon, his press secretary, Gerald resigned in protest. That news overtook everything, kind of overshadowed everything else. Back then, no cable, no internet, no anything like that. So events just galloped away, and they never had a chance to go back and piece it together. I do have some other theories, and I'm happy to talk about that in the Q&A. But I was fortunate to interview President Ford in 1999 on camera as part of the program that I was putting together at Duquesne University. We did it right at the beautiful presidential museum in Grand Rapids, where we were yesterday. As you know, President Ford died in 2006 at the age of 93, but I thought it would be fitting to show that video tonight so that you can hear what President Ford himself had to say about the pardon.
Good afternoon, President Ford. My name is Professor Ken Gormley, and it's an honor to join you here in the very beautiful Gerald R. Ford Museum in Grand Rapids. As you know, today is the 25th anniversary of your controversial decision to pardon your predecessor in the White House, President Richard M. Nixon. And I have just a few questions as we look back on that event in history. The single issue that seemed to dwarf all others in the eyes of the American public after the pardon was, did President Ford cut a deal with Richard Nixon in advance to pardon him? Can you answer that question directly, Mr. President? Was there a deal of any sort?
I testified before the House Committee on Judiciary that there was no deal, period. I think those are my exact words. And I can assure you, some 25 years later, that there is absolutely no credibility to that allegation. The truth is, I was going to be president without any question of a doubt, because President Nixon was either going to be impeached and forced to resign, or he was going to resign on his own, as he did. So I was going to become president, period, regardless of any comments between him and myself.
And now that you're able to look back on your presidency with the benefit of 25 years hindsight, I ask you this simple question: would you pardon Richard M. Nixon again if you had it to do over?
Well, based on some additional observations, testimony, etc., I think today, if I had to go through the same process with more evidence, I would certainly have executed a pardon on his behalf. There was no doubt when I did it back in September of 1974 that I was doing the right thing, regardless of what the press said, regardless of what many Americans said. It was absolutely, unequivocally the right thing to do for the country. And you had to look at it from that point of view to understand why I took the action that I did.
And did we learn anything more recently from the exhausting and divisive Clinton scandal this past year? Did it shed any light on what the nation might have endured back in 1974 if President Nixon had not been pardoned, but rather subject to full-blown criminal prosecution?
Well, the Clinton difficulties, I think, illustrate that the impeachment process is a very, very difficult one. You have to have action by the committees in the House. You have to have House action, which means a full-blown debate. You have to have a decision by the House of Representatives, and then the case has to go before the United States Senate on the actual question of conviction or otherwise. Now, in the Nixon case, if there had been an impeachment vote by the House Committee on Judiciary, followed by a vote in the House of Representatives with all the debate, and then subsequent action in the Senate, as there was in the Clinton case, it would have been an atmosphere in the United States that would have precluded the Congress and my White House from trying to solve the basic problems we had at home or internationally with the Cold War.
So you're as comfortable as we sit here today with the decision as when you sat in the Oval Office 25 years ago today and spoke into the television cameras and granted the pardon?
No question about it. I'm even firmer in my conviction that I did the right thing for the country. And I'm pleased to see that recent polls have indicated that more and more people in America today are agreeing with me than they did 25 years ago.
That's the benefit of history, isn't it?
Right.
Well, thank you very much for sitting down with me today to discuss this historic event.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. President.
That program with that video was aired nationally on C-SPAN. I remember being in my office at work and my secretary called and said, "There's a guy who says he's Gerald Ford on the phone. Should I hang up?" And I said, I better take that. And it was President Ford just thanking me for, putting together this. It obviously meant a great deal that people understood his motives for this. And so you can certainly debate the wisdom and the timing of the decision to pardon Nixon, but there is even more support than when I spoke to President Ford in 1999 for the proposition that, however awkwardly and hurriedly executed, that the pardon probably was the right thing to do in the end. And in fact, before President Ford died, you may know that he received the Profiles in Courage Award from the Kennedy Library, and that was especially meaningful for him after years and years of criticism. And I think that what we can learn from this piece of American history is that the essence of leadership involves making decisions even when they do run counter to public opinion, even when they run counter to the advice of your own close advisors. The true test of conscience comes when an individual faces giving up his or her job or career or political future, as was the case here, to follow his or her own internal compass. And incidentally, I should mention, Gerald Ford was angry at Richard Nixon by this time. I mean, Gerald Ford had been out there defending Richard Nixon, and then all of a sudden these tapes come out, and the smoking gun tape and everything. And Gerald Ford had been really humiliated almost because Nixon was up to his ears in the Watergate cover-up and let Ford take that position all that time. Yet he still had room in his heart for mercy, as his son Steve said so beautifully at the program yesterday at the museum. And so I think the only way that one has the strength of character to meet these impossible situations is to spend one's whole life following a detailed set of principles in every instance of decision making, big or small. Otherwise, when the big issue comes and the pressure is on, it's almost impossible to withstand that and to make the tough calls. I believe that Gerald R. Ford made his mark as a leader, as a public figure, because he did have a strong internal compass to guide him, forged very close to here in very, very kind of typical American city. And he drew on that inner compass even at difficult and lonely moments when nobody else can help him. And I do believe the moral grounding, without that, it would have been impossible for him to do that. So as we mark the 40th anniversary of Ford's pardon of Richard Nixon as a nation, I think that this is a lesson that is worth reflecting on for all of us who care about our system of laws and our system of justice and government in the United States, and especially for those in our law schools, in our great universities like the one right up the road here, and for those studying in great presidential libraries like this who will one day become the next generation of leaders. So thank you very much for the honor of joining you this evening, and I'm happy to answer questions.
One hopefully quick question before my main question. I'm always intrigued when I have listened to the Ford's pardoning announcement that he says June 20th, 1969. I'm assuming
Yeah.
he means January?
Yeah, that was an error they later corrected.
And so the document itself?
Yes, correct.
Okay, considering the Ford pardon, which I totally agree with, pardon of Nixon, but also maybe Clinton's pardon of Mark Rich and others, how do you feel about, as some others have suggested, there needs to be some kind of formal check on the president's pardoning power?
That is a really interesting question. I can tell you I testified in the Senate at the time that there was a movement to amend the Constitution having to do with the pardon power when President Clinton pardoned Mark Rich. I took the position that that would not be a sensible approach. And this is really a good example. If you go back and look at the history, why the pardon power is in the Constitution, it is meant to be as broad as it is. Some great examples of the pardon power being used, President Lincoln used it to pardon some of the Sioux Indians involved in the Sioux Uprising, even though his own grandfather had been scalped. President Andrew Johnson used the pardon power to pardon Confederate generals after the Civil War. He could have easily listened to people who wanted them hanged, but he had to end it somewhere and let the country move on. President Carter gave amnesty to Vietnam draft dodgers who went to Canada because that chapter had to be over. And I do think it's a question, as was discussed yesterday a little bit, of whether you're looking to the future of the country or trying to dwell in the past. And I don't know there's any way that you can check that power. It is one of the most fundamental powers of the chief executive of this United States to be able to make that call. And in this case, I think Ford absolutely did it for precisely the right reason, which was to allow the country to heal. That's the name of his book, A Time to Heal. Allow the country to heal and move on. We'd had enough of that. And incidentally, let me just say, having written a book on Bill Clinton, and those of you who followed the whole Monica Lewinsky, I interviewed Monica, Paula Jones, and all of the cast of characters, President Clinton himself. But do you realize one of the things I discovered in that book was that as we as a country were obsessed with Bill Clinton's sexual escapades 20 years earlier when he was governor of Arkansas, we now know that there was a little-known effort to assassinate him in the Philippines with a bomb under a bridge big enough to blow up the whole entourage, and fortunately the Secret Service figured this out. It was planted there by a little-known terrorist named Osama bin Laden. So that's what was going on as people were plotting our attack inside and outside our country. We as a country were obsessed with these things. So a president has to be able to make those calls. Thank you very much for that question.
Dean Gormley, thank you for a very stimulating talk. I have a question for you. I have read that, granted that the pardon was the right thing to do for the country, the manner in which it was done was wrong. That is, that there were Republican leaders in the Senate and the House who wanted President Ford to do this and were considering going public with that suggestion, and the president could have called upon them to make some public statement and get some public discussion going, at least for a short period of time. That would have taken the political heat off of him. He's now responding to a public call. Do you have a comment on that?
Yeah, that's real. I hadn't heard that. I think if President Ford were still alive today and you proposed that, he'd say, that's a great idea. I should have done that. Because I think, very honestly, it comes down to this fundamental basic fact. President Ford was a very decisive person. He was an Eagle Scout, as you know, but he was a person who was used to making decisions, and that was it. And once he decided it, he told me this, and I've talked to others, and I think this was the case. He just felt he needed to do it at that point and move on. If he had tried to develop a consensus, that may have been wise. Now, I do want to say, it's interesting that you raised that, sir, because as you may remember, during the Clinton difficulties, as President Ford described them, there was a bipartisan effort to try to come up with a compromise there, which was the censure resolution, to get everyone, something worked out. And do you remember who the principal proponents of that were? Gerald R. Ford and Jimmy Carter. Gerald R. Ford really pushed for that. But the bottom line was no one was going to do it. It actually stirred things up more to a certain extent by the political forces. So would it have actually worked? I'm not sure. It may have made people more outraged at the time if the notion had been made public beforehand. And I think that was kind of what Ford's calculation was, is I just need to do it and cut the knot and be done with this. And if we start having a public discourse on this, it's going to all unravel. And it could unravel on the Nixon end, don't forget, because everyone's assuming, I think we all assume, that President Nixon, of course, is going to accept the pardon and give them the papers and write a statement that includes contrition. There was no certainty at that at all. He was walking on eggshells during this whole time. But that's an excellent point.
Thank you.
Thank you.
My mother-in-law never gave up on Richard Nixon. She said, our dear president has been done in by those people. And I'm concerned about accountability, about judicial process, and about the way history is taught. Especially in the high school textbooks tend to sanitize history, so it's very easy to bury things like this. And I think that when President Obama became president, he didn't want to look back. He didn't want to indict the people who entered Iraq. And it was a similar kind of thing. It wasn't an amnesty, it wasn't a pardon. But I think that people in public life have a tendency to do this. And it takes the accountability out of the political process. So I think, particularly because it has an effect on the way history is taught and the way our past is perceived, it's very important.
Well, I agree with most of what you said, but just let me, maybe I misunderstood one piece of it. But in this case, President Ford's decision did not take the accountability out of anything. The accountability was, you don't like this decision, vote against me in 1976. That is the essence of the political process. He used his presidential powers that are spelled out in the Constitution. He made the decision, and the public took a political path. I have to say that I have generally been a proponent of keeping your eye on the 8 ball so you don't get... I agree with you completely, sir, incidentally, that we need far more civics education in our schools. It's deplorable, I think, and even in colleges and law schools. I mean, and I'm teaching this course on presidents and the Constitution because I think lawyers should know about those things too. But I do think that it's also not serving anyone. I happen to be a Democrat, and I wrote the biography of Archibald Cox and all of that. But I wrote op-eds at the time saying that President Clinton's conduct was not impeachable, even though it was appalling. It didn't fit the definition of what the framers intended. But I felt the same way when people wanted to impeach President George W. Bush for the weapons of mass destruction stuff. That's not a productive use of our system because we're not going to get anywhere with that. You have to keep your eye on the 8 ball. You don't hide it, you talk about it, but if you don't like that, you sweep out that party and you put in people who will do, you think, the right thing. So on one hand, I agree. I think it's essential that we talk about these things. I think it's essential that younger people learn about it, even the rough spots of it. But I also admire people like Ford who had the long view rather than just trying to do what was going to get him to his next personal goal. Thank you, sir.
Professor Gormley, as a presidential scholar, do you feel any contempt toward Richard Nixon, and what does his scorecard look like?
I don't feel any contempt toward Richard Nixon. It's funny, when we did the program in Pittsburgh on the date of the pardon. One of the panelists was Timothy Naftali, you may know, was the former head of the Nixon Library and did a fabulous job really in bringing Watergate, which had really not been incorporated very much into that library. But after talking to Tim a great deal, because he had ferreted out so much stuff about Richard Nixon, I said, actually, Richard Nixon didn't escape anything at all. His principal punishment here is that he got Tim Naftali as the director of his library. You know? It's very easy to forget a lot of the significant things that Richard Nixon did do. And by today's standards, some of them were fairly enlightened, you know, and it wasn't just China and obviously that historic decision, but he, even on the domestic front, he sponsored a lot of key pieces of legislation. Now he did, you know, bomb Cambodia and produce the War Powers Act and try to impound funds that, when he didn't agree with Congress. So there are those problems, but it's a tragic story. I feel that it is a tragic story, and I always remember when Nixon died, all of the news media descended on Archibald Cox. I was working on his book at the time for a quote, and he gave the great Latin quote that translates roughly into, "Of the dead, say nothing, you know, say nothing positive or nothing at all." But I do think that Richard Nixon goes down in history as perhaps the most tragic president, and that is his punishment, because, of course, that was the most important thing to him.
Thank you.
So much for all those tapes for Richard Nixon, yeah. Yes, sir.
Yeah, during my lifetime, the most outrageous pardon wasn't Mark Rich and it wasn't Richard Nixon. It was George H.W. Bush pardoning the Iran-Contra figures. And I'm wondering, since you worked on a book on Archibald Cox, what is your opinion of this role of the special prosecutor, and do you think pardons should be used in that fashion in which there really was a cover-up?
Well, we'd have to come back for another program on that. I have written a lot about the special prosecutor law. I testified in the Senate at the time they were considering abolishing it. I was one of the last living human beings who thought we should have some form of a special prosecutor law, because inevitably, when these things come up, you have to have some rules in place when people at the top of the executive pyramid are accused of wrongdoing. So I am familiar with the Iran-Contra pardons, and I have to say that even there, I would not second guess the judgment of President Bush, because that's his job. He's chief executive. He's in charge of the executive branch, which put people in jail or whatever, and he has the final say. If he thinks, you know, the early examples of the pardon power, you probably know, were when people were being put in jail for political purposes in the early part of in the early years of the founding of our nation. And so it was very much designed to, often the president's people would end up, you know, indicted in jail or whatever. That's clearly how George H.W. Bush viewed it, and I think both of us probably disagree with that, but I would not second guess his ability to do that as president. Well, thank you very much for a wonderful evening, and I'm happy to chat afterwards.
I told you I thought this would be informative, and for all of Ken's work on behalf of this program and Presidential Libraries, we have for you a pin set with the signature of our president, Gerald R. Ford.
So thank you very much, and I much prefer this to a pair of Nixon cufflinks, so thank you very much.